All right, it is now 2, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, the last in our series, Unpacking PREA, the North Carolina approach to victim services behind bars. This webinar is a culmination of all the information our presenters have shared, focused on the development of the Memoranda of Understanding, or MOU, to provide victim services to incarcerated survivors. My name is Gabriella Nyman, the Training and Communication Specialist with NC CASA, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we start our webinar, here's some basic information about NC CASA. We are an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. We use a social justice framework, therefore our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. Some of our work includes the Training Institute, supporting our rape crisis centers, resource sharing and technical assistance, legislative and policy work, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, working with colleges and universities, and providing access to language services. I want to provide a few webinar logistics. As a reminder, all participants are muted throughout. Please enter any discussion responses in the chat box at the bottom of your screen as shown in the slide. We will also use polls and encourage your participation. We will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to ask them at any time. You can submit a question in the Q&A button. I will be keeping an eye on that throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and a recording will be posted on NC CASA's website and also our YouTube channel in the next coming days, along with the resources mentioned in this webinar. If you have trouble with Zoom, please email me at gabriella@nccasa.org. We made it. This is the 8th and final webinar in this series. As we have mentioned earlier, ideally we would have had this training in person, but as a result of COVID-19, NC CASA has been able to still reach our partners across North Carolina and beyond, and the webinars will be available for people in the months and years to come to help them with their work to provide support to incarcerated survivors. We started this series in June with the webinar on grounding in humanity. We then looked at PREA from a bigger picture perspective, starting broadly with the rates of incarcerations across the US and North Carolina and the rates of sexual victimization. Each week we narrowed that focus, turning on trauma-informed care, reporting options and confidentiality, and safety for at-risk populations, a 2-part webinar. Last week we focused on the PREA audit, both in terms of how a facility is evaluated for PREA compliance and then on how victim advocates can support the facility, staff, and prisoners throughout the audit process. We know some of you have been with us throughout the entire series, but if not, you can catch up by accessing the recordings of the webinars on our website and, like I mentioned, our YouTube channel. So here we are, the last webinar in the series. Today our presenters will focus on the Memoranda of Understanding, or MOU, as it relates to the PREA and victim services to survivors in confinement settings. The webinar series has been a building and layering process. We deliberately teased apart the various aspects of providing confidential support services to get us to today's webinar, the MOU. For those of you who have joined us for the other webinars, you know the wealth of information taken into consideration to get us to this point. All things to be considered as agencies and organizations begin development of our work to revise existing MOUs. Today's webinar will not only provide guidance and recommendations for the development of an MOU, but will also highlight tools that you can utilize to guide this process. We also have 2 guests joining us today. They will share with us their experience establishing an MOU, including hurdles they experienced along the way and how those were overcome. We hope that the practical advice will empower you and your agencies or organizations to embark on the MOU journey. I would like to introduce you to our presenters for the webinar. Tara Graham, she, her, hers, Senior Program Director at Just Detention International. Tara spent nearly 14 years working on the development and implementation of the PREA standards. Lisa Cook, she, her, hers, jail consultant for NC CASA. Lisa is a former Buncombe County Jail PREA coordinator and was a DOJ certified PREA auditor. In her work with NC CASA, she assists in creating trainings in partnership with us and other agencies. She is the co-author of the North Carolina Approach, Creating and Navigating New Relationships to Better Serve Incarcerated Survivors of Sexual Assault, a resource that we have gone over and will continue to go over in this webinar series. I will now hand the webinar over to Tara.
Great, thanks so much, Gabriella, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. As I look through the list of attendees, I see a lot of familiar names, so thank you for hanging in there with us. I hope that it's been valuable information over all of these weeks. Here we are in the middle of summer. It's hot, I know, so I hope people are staying safe, that you're staying cool, and we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. So I want to quickly thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their generous support, which is allowing us to provide you with this webinar and several of the webinars in this series. And for those of you that have joined us previously, you know that Just Detention International, or JDI, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. And we do that in a variety of different ways. Our partnership here with NC CASA is a perfect example of how we partner with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make facilities safe. We also work to change public attitudes so they can value the dignity and safety of people in detention. And we also support incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. In a few moments, we'll watch a short video of Joe, who is a survivor of sexual abuse and confinement, and he is a member of our Survivor Council, a group of survivors that lend their advice and perspective on the work that we do at JDI. And like I've said in every webinar, JDI's core principle is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, that rape is not part of the penalty. And as always, we just want to remind you about self-care. Please take care of yourselves. Again, like I said, in a moment, we're going to hear from Joe, a survivor of sexual abuse in detention. And if you need to step away for a few minutes, please do so and then come back and join us, or whatever else that you need to do for self-care during this webinar. Before we hear from Joe, we want to hear from you. I can see that a few of you have already started to greet each other in the chat box. So I just invite you to go ahead and share your name and where you are from. So we'll take a minute for folks to be able to do that. Great, thank you, Gabriella from NC CASA. Hi, Mo, joining from Albany, New York. That's fantastic. Thank you for joining us all the way from up north. Danielle from Long Island. This is fantastic. Melinda, as always, such a pleasure to have you. Melinda, as some of you know, has been featured in 2 of our webinars from Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office. Thanks for coming again, for joining us, Melinda. Wow, so many people. Let's see here, who else do we have? Erica from NC CASA, Brandy from SAFE of Harnett County, Amra from Skedvasa. Nice to see your name on there, Amra. It's great to have you from South Carolina. Courtney with NC CASA, Imani from Fayetteville, Virginia from the Rape Crisis Center in Lumberton, North Carolina. Angie from High Point, or I'm sorry, Family Services of the High Point, Guilford County in High Point, North Carolina. Chris, my colleague who's from JDI and actually works in our Los Angeles office. Barbara from Safe Home in Ashe County. Corey, who's another one of our presenters today. She's from Safe Alliance in Charlotte. Crystal from UCare. Nisi from Family Crisis Council in Salisbury. And Lori from Denton, Texas, with Friends of the Family Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Agency. So this is a treat. I'm always curious. Oh, and Nicole, great, from New River, North Carolina. I I would just encourage those of you that are from out of state, I'd love for you to make a note in the chat about how you heard about the webinars. I know some people have been joining us over the time, but it's always just sort of interesting to hear how people have heard about this. So thank you for sharing all that information. So we're gonna do one quick poll. I think it's the only poll we have today, but it's really for us to get a sense of where people are with respect to having an MOU. So Gabriella is going to launch it in just a moment, and so please select the answer that best represents where your facility or organization is. Again, it looks like most people are from victim advocacy organizations, and the question is about whether or not your facility or organization has an MOU or other kind of agreement to provide services to incarcerated survivors. So yes, you have an MOU, no you don't, you're working on one, you've tried but have faced some challenges, or you're not sure.
I'll give another 30 seconds before we close the poll.
And while we're waiting to close the poll, I just want to thank those of you that have said where you've heard about these webinars. It's really great feedback. Thank you.
Right, so it looks like yes, we have an MOU is 35%. No, we do not have an MOU is 24%. We are working on it now, 0%. We have tried but faced some challenges, 6%, and I am not sure, 35%.
Great, thank you so much for that, Gabriella, and thank you for everyone for weighing in. And I think we'll probably mention this later on, but I would certainly encourage those of you that answered that you're not sure to go back to your agencies and organizations after this webinar and see where things are. And hopefully, if you don't have one in place, that the information that you hear about today will help you in moving your organization forward to establishing that kind of agreement. So again, we want to start today by emphasizing the importance of confidential support services to incarcerated survivors. The video we're going to watch features Joe, a survivor of sexual abuse in confinement and a member of JDI's Survivor Council, like I mentioned. He is going to talk about the sexual abuse he experienced while in confinement and the support he received from a rape crisis counselor. The video is about 6 minutes long. So if you need to step away, please do so and then rejoin us after the video concludes. I do want to say that you're going to see a victim advocate featured in this video, and she is now one of our colleagues at JDI. She wasn't at the time this video was created, but she is now. So with that, I'm going to share my screen of this video, so bear with me and we'll get this started. And Gabriella or Lisa, please let me know if you're unable to hear the audio.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to check in with. And all those people, they all referred to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing. Because I'm a person with a name. And the first thing I told her was, my name's Joe.
Joe was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault, advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters. And I would read, you know, these words, and the feelings that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. You know, the self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, you know, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist. And my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, we'll get you moved. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me and he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains and put me back in the cell. Nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top bunk. He grabbed my ankle and he pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me, and the third, and the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. And, you know, with survivors who weren't incarcerated, you know, they could just pick up the phone and call. You know, we had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, you know, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, you know, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and like tangible about getting a letter, you know, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like. And then being able to write back, it was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way that I couldn't have been on the phone. Like in an immediate crisis, I was able to really be very thoughtful in my responses.
Jessica was my advocate when I was assaulted. She was the person that said it wasn't my fault.
I meant it.
That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me, I know you've been raped, I knew without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After the assault, I had been treated like a number. And she asked me my name and she touched my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
So I want to say thank you to Joe for sharing his story with us. I've seen that video many times and I always find it incredibly powerful. So thank you to Joe, and thank you also to Jessica for providing the services that Joe deserved. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Lisa. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Tara. Now we wanted to really turn and look at how you can lay the groundwork for a strong partnership. We'll start with a guest presenter that's going to give us some real world examples. But before we do that, I want to read this quote from Martin, who is formerly incarcerated and sexually abused while in prison. I know that a lot of advocates and people doing that work also are filled with news media and these lockup shows and stories about what we do in prison. And I think the more people watch those things, the less human I become. And I think that's really pertinent when we think about the video with Joe. So just reminding us as we do this work. So our first guest speaker certainly believes in the importance of making sure every survivor gets the support that they need to heal, no matter where they lay their head down at night. I'm pleased to welcome Corey Goldstein, she, her, hers, Chief Deputy Operating Officer for Safe Alliance in Charlotte, North Carolina. In this series, we've heard from Sheriff McFadden and Melinda Ingram, the PREA coordinator for Mecklenburg County Jail. It's wonderful to have Corey with us today to really talk about the work that they've been doing, building that partnership. So inmates, well, residents as they call them at the jail, have access to confidential support services. Corey has degrees in psychology and a master's in social work. She spent close to 15 years working in the area of trauma, specifically focusing on clients that have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. As a licensed clinical social worker, Corey worked as a mental health clinician in Raleigh, North Carolina, using evidence-based models to help survivors cope with trauma. In 2013, Corey joined Safe Alliance, and she provides support to the Sexual Trauma Resource Center, the Greater Charlotte Hope Line, and the Domestic Violence Shelter. So Corey, welcome. Good to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by telling us about Safe Alliance?
So yes, Safe Alliance is, we're a local nonprofit in Mecklenburg County, and so we provide hope and healing to those that have been impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault. And so we are considered, I guess, for the county, the local rape crisis agency, and provide hotline response, hospital accompaniment. We also provide advocacy and help with connecting to resources, as well as just long-term counseling options for survivors in regards to sexual assault. And then within domestic violence, we help with our shelter, having the that's confidential location, as well as just helping with court accompaniment as well.
Okay, awesome. Now I really want to talk specifically about the partnership that you guys have with Mecklenburg County Jail. How long has that partnership existed, and what kind of services do you guys provide directly to the jail?
So the relationship actually started prior to my joining the agency, or prior to coming to Safe Alliance. So when I look back at documents and I got engaged once I started from my supervisor at the time, but the documents go back to 2013 when we started having these conversations and really starting to look at how can we offer support to residents within the jail. An MOU was actually signed in August 2016. And so it was kind of a long road to get to that signing of the first MOU. But at this time, we have hospital response. We have 24/7 hotline. We have continuously received letters, and so we're continuing to receive letters as well. And so that's kind of what our current services are. We just recently signed an MOU for providing services and working with the juvenile population as well. But that's pretty much the scope of where we are at this point.
Okay, great. And can you tell us a little bit about the development of the agreement that you guys first started with, and then kind of how often that's reviewed, and maybe what were some of those things that you guys had to really discuss to get that agreement signed and really get where you are today?
So yes, so I guess to start, and I'm glad that Melinda is on here as well, because I think that our MOU really would not have been possible without someone keeping the process moving forward. And so Melinda Ingram with Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office was really a champion within the system, within the jail. She was a true advocate and really kind of kept that process going. And although I think she has been the one constant in this time span, because I see her name going back even prior to my joining in 2013 in the process. So it definitely has been a process. We review our MOU. We have it written in the language to review it every 3 years, but we can review it prior to that if needed, or if we want to increase or add. We've added language in there to allow us to update it at a different time if we would like. We just renewed it actually in 2019. So almost a year ago, we were able to renew it and for another 3 years. When thinking about kind of what we had to discuss even after the MOU was signed, one thing I can say is that we are continuously open to modifying it and really kind of would love to take that next step to get to those in-person services at some point. But we also recognize that we had to have some sort of first step or a starting point. Everyone has to start somewhere, and we didn't want to get held back with having something in place to begin providing services as we could as soon as possible. And so we really kind of started with those easy wins. We already were providing hospital response. So we really just wanted to get something in writing to talk about what that might look like. We were already doing a 24/7 hotline. And so ultimately, we just needed to figure out a system around the cost and how we were going to navigate that. And so I still actually remember the day that we tried out our kind of workaround system for the collect calls, and it did work. And we were able to kind of move forward and be able to navigate the hotline calls. And then after that, we just really had to continue that conversation because we had to recognize, and we did recognize, that those at the jail had to help in developing the training. They are the experts within their population. And so we really needed someone to give us that expertise and help us out. And then they arranged a tour of the facility so our staff could really have an understanding of the person that's calling and what they're navigating each day.
Well, it sounds like you guys have really done a whole lot to develop this. And I know that we've spoken with you before. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of getting it signed? I know that it wasn't always Safe Alliance that was involved with Mecklenburg. Is that correct?
So, yeah, I think that there's definitely been, it's definitely been a learning curve kind of as we've navigated this process. And so we've all been learning along the way. And there was at one point another organization that came to the table. They were in Mecklenburg County and had offered to provide some of the services free, all of the services actually free of charge. And so I think that what we were able to do at that point was step back out of the conversation, and NC CASA then stepped in and was really able to provide education not only to the jails but also to the other provider, just so that they were aware of the scope of what they were agreeing to do.
Okay, and knowing what you know now, and especially since the facility has been audited, what advice would you give other advocates and agencies in the development of an agreement and their provision of services?
So I think there's definitely a few takeaways that I can share. And so the first one is to have patience and keep moving forward. I think that throughout the time span, if I look back since 2013, there's been a lot of staff turnover or promotions of different staff moving in and out of the process. And that really kind of did slow down everything on both sides. And as I mentioned before, I think Melinda Ingram was kind of that most consistent person that really kind of kept us moving forward. And so one piece of advice is just to have that patience, to have trust in the process, and to just keep moving forward. Another one is to, as an agency, we knew what we called non-negotiables were. So we knew what we needed to have when we came to the table. And so some of examples of those were confidentiality was extremely important to us. And so that was going to be a big part of the MOU for us to sign it. We also had a lot of discussions around who was responsible for cost. As a nonprofit organization, we're not necessarily resource rich. And so we really had to think about our services and the scope of those services and how we could best provide these services. And so that was something that we really held on to in the conversations. And there were occasions to where we had to regroup. We had to come back to the table, and that's something we were okay with. We were okay with knowing where we stood and okay with letting the system and the process play out, with letting people know up front, this is what we are able to provide. I think another one was just to be open to outside support. I know you asked a little bit earlier, you commented a little bit earlier about kind of another organization stepping in. And I think for us, NC CASA was a huge support. Not only did NC CASA draft our MOU, which was also a lifesaver, but they remained available throughout the entire process. It was almost like they were a neutral stance. We were able to come to the table and have conversations, but they were also some of the same conversations we were having about the importance of advocacy and the importance of confidentiality. They were having those same conversations at different times. Saying the same thing and really helping to ensure that the client's perspective was really brought to the table and understood at different levels, as well as just the expertise on PREA. That was so crucial, and it was something that we valued and they were able to help us with. And then the work that they provided with just the conversations with the other agency and their willingness to provide the services free of charge. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of stood by our non-negotiables and we kind of stepped away for a little bit, but NC CASA stayed involved and continued to talk with both groups. And then eventually we did come back to the table. And then I guess finally, my last point, I'm sure there's so many I could think of, but my last point is it's all about the relationship. So I think even if you feel stuck or you feel like you're not moving forward, that the relationship building will be at your advantage in the future. And so it's just important to know that it might take time. It took us at least 3 years from what I can see in our documents, and that included many phone calls and meetings and attorney reviews of draft MOUs, just for us to establish the first MOU. But it only took a few emails and phone calls to get to sign our most recent MOU that was specific to adolescents. And so I think that just sticking with it and really building that relationship is huge as well.
That's awesome. What would you say, like during that whole development process of the MOU, or even after, even now, something that may have been said to you or that you found to be really helpful to provide services to incarcerated survivors?
I think from the beginning, we recognized the skill set that each entity brought to the table. So yes, we could provide education around sexual assault and how that may look and some training around that, but we really needed the employees from the jail to educate us as well. Probably if I think about like one specific tangible thing, it was just they were able to give us some language specific to the jail that was beneficial. And so then our staff were able to be trained so that we could fully meet the caller where they were when they called us without having to seek a lot of clarifying information. There's definitely nicknames or different terms that people use, and us having that knowledge as well as the tour and the other pieces was allowing us to really meet that caller and provide the best level and the best service possible. And so I think that was probably the most helpful in recognizing that everybody had a skill base and a knowledge that they were bringing, and that we really were able to build that relationship to help each other out. So they could train us, we could provide training. We worked together to develop materials for the inmates. So it really became kind of that team approach, and that's continued. They continue to come to our Sexual Assault Awareness Month activities. We can continue to attend theirs. We're helping them as best possible host a training they're navigating in the fall as well.
Great. And I know you said you have already signed another MOU with their juvenile provisions, and that you just signed the MOU in 2019, updated that one. But especially with COVID-19 in mind, how might you envision your relationship evolving, and what are you guys continuing to really discuss and talk about?
So a lot of our most recent trainings, I think just with COVID-19, we've all been at the space of just trying to stay caught up, because it's like you develop one plan and then you have to adapt it the next day because information is just coming at you so quickly. And so I think in regards to that specifically, with our work with the jail, we haven't had a lot of conversations about that piece of it. I think what we have been trying to figure out is how do we as an agency ensure that we're providing the services to the community, and that includes the services that we're providing through our MOU to residents within the jail. A lot of our most recent conversations have really centered around just ongoing training and that support around training. So like I mentioned, I know that the jail is putting together a conference this fall, and so we're offering to help as best possible and to be able to provide that support. And then I think we are just as an agency starting to get to a level where we can start looking at into the future, because we know with COVID-19, this is not going away. So we really are looking at how, now that we can take a breath, how do we start looking at our services and seeing how we can adapt them to make sure we're fully meeting the needs of the community.
Well, that sounds really amazing. I do want to let everyone know, if you do have any questions of Corey, feel free to type those into the chat box, and we can certainly get to them while she's on our call. And I really want to thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
All right. Thanks again, Corey, for sharing about Safe Alliance and really that collaboration you guys have been going through over the years with Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office there. As we mentioned in earlier webinars, this relationship building is really the most critical part of this partnership. A successful partnership is really going to be enhanced with the partners knowing and understanding each other. Remember that there are likely many different partners to be involved in these discussions, whether it's about confidential support services or other opportunities you have for growth. Don't forget what we talked about in the second part of the at-risk populations webinar, that there might be non-traditional partners or allies that can also benefit from these discussions too, and bring those to the table. So some key partners to include and invite to the table. We definitely want to make sure that you have a PREA coordinator, and we say also a PREA compliance manager. Most jails within the state of North Carolina are only operating one facility. However, those that have multiple locations will also have PREA compliance managers. So you're going to have multiple people at the table. Often, especially for the average jail and the smaller jails, you're just going to have that coordinator. And of course, leadership staff and medical, mental health staff that's on site there or that's contracted out. You want rape crisis directors, any of the SART coordinators or those that are involved in those SART teams locally, and other advocates, especially those advocates that are going to be serving these survivors at the facility. And any other coalition partners, especially NC CASA here in North Carolina. I cannot emphasize enough, and I'm so glad Corey was able to bring that up, that they were really helpful in the whole process and they are willing to support you. But not all of these partners are going to be involved all of the time. In an initial meeting, the jail may only have a few of these people present. It may just be someone from the Rape Crisis Center that's kind of the person deemed to get the ball rolling, and the PREA coordinator. But talk about the different pieces of this work and really discuss who makes the most sense to be involved when you do start these conversations. It's really important that the work's not just sitting with one person at the jail. In case they're promoted or they leave, you really want to try to build a relationship with multiple individuals within the sheriff's office, within the jail administration and staff there. The PREA standards final rule noted the importance of facility leadership in combating sexual abuse and confinement by stating, The success of the PREA standards in combating the sexual abuse in confinement facilities will depend on effective agency and facility leadership and the development of an agency culture that prioritizes efforts to combat sexual abuse. Effective leadership and culture cannot, of course, be directly mandated by rule. Yet implementation of the standards will help foster a change in culture by institutionalizing policies and procedures that bring these concerns to the forefront. So again, leadership support is critical. Building those relationships with partner agencies must extend beyond the staff coordinating the services, must extend beyond that PREA coordinator and reach the leadership level. Supportive involvement of leadership contributes to effective systems and processes and establishes a relationship that involves that leadership. You know, we have a few suggestions that you really should focus on. You know, again, like Corey said, they just had to stick to it when they were first signing that. So be diligent. You know, not everyone is available all the time. And especially if you're an agency that's trying to contact the jail or vice versa, you know, go take them a cup of coffee and visit them at their business, at their location, if phone calls aren't working, if you can, or if emails aren't working. Make sure you contact the jail administrators and offer to provide services to survivors. This will hopefully include the sheriff as a jail administrator, but it might not. It might only directly involve just that jail administrator that could be of many different names or ranks depending on the agency. Invite jail officials, at least the PREA coordinator, to community SART meetings if you guys are already holding those. It'll give them a taste of the work you do. And offer to allow jail staff to participate in any trainings you offer on sexual abuse and ask them to join any relevant trainings they may offer within the jail. It's a good way just to start interacting and really creating a relationship. And along with these items, you really want to discuss with leadership and point out the responsibilities of each agency that each agency has to survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. You know, ask how your agency can help meet the needs of that facility and bring multiple solutions to the table all the time and try to do what you can. All right, so as we discussed, embarking on this partnership and this relationship to provide services to these incarcerated survivors takes a lot of time. Sometimes it can happen more quickly, and other times there may be hurdles to overcome along the way. But we've emphasized throughout the webinar series the importance of really building this relationship for a successful partnership. Think about values that your organization or agency embodies. Take a minute to share in the chat what those core values are. See if you can let us know if you are an advocacy agency. Give us some ideas of values that you guys hold. Or if you are on the corrections side, feel free to make note of any values that you have with your agency and just type it into that chat box. And it can be really any values, you know, basic values that you hold, even just, you know, as a larger agency, please don't be shy. All right, well, I don't have any, it doesn't look like anyone's willing to add into the chat. I know that when I was starting a lot of these trainings and when I first started, oh, here we go. Community, trust, empathy, sounds great. I was gonna say on the corrections side, definitely something we always thought of was safety, security, you know, and really supporting our community. So back to that community, yes, treat all survivors with dignity and respect, great. Safety is paramount, yes, very much so, on all sides, I believe. All right, so I know we've added some of the advocates' values under here. So if we can go ahead and hear some, again, yes, safety, improving public safety overall. Again, on the advocates' values, you know, we've got improving public safety by changing rape culture. That's big on both sides. And then some of those shared values. It's really not uncommon for us to, as corrections and advocates, to see all these differences, but to help in this partnership building, just like Corey was saying earlier, we all bring different strengths to the table, but in order to see the similarities and differences and the struggles that we face as we work together and move forward to provide these services, we really kind of need to see where we overlap. And as you can see in this graphic, and we shared in the chat, we have different values, but really at the core of this, we do have shared values and we do have a lot in common. And we know that perpetrators should be held accountable and no one deserves to be raped. And residents, inmates, prisoners, they're all still members of our community as well. So as we discuss the similarities and differences, they can be part of that early discussion in your meetings together. It doesn't hurt to start discussing confidentiality at that first meeting because that can be a really big hurdle. The goal at this point shouldn't be able to reach a perfect agreement, but to really recognize the similarities and differences about confidentiality and over time work to reach an agreement about what confidentiality will look like for the services you guys are going to provide. Adrienne Nichols, a former advocate in West Virginia, shared the following regarding getting to know her corrections partners. I have to understand law enforcement and they have to understand me. And it's important to have face-to-face meetings to build those relationships. I know we spoke specifically in earlier webinars about confidentiality, and you know, in this, she's very right in saying these face-to-face meetings are better than over the phone, but I know with COVID, we can't really meet in person, and video meetings might be one option to help bridge that. But once in-person meetings are possible, we really encourage you to be there, get there, you know, whether it's at the organization's office or at the jail, and take turns where you meet. Again, Corey emphasized how great it was to understand what the jail looked like, because just seeing where each other works really helps to understand where everyone's coming from. And really review and learn about both the Rape Crisis Center and the jail. For example, you know, share that general information like the facility population, you know, the average length of stay, other facility details that might not actually be on the website that the agency feels comfortable sharing. It should be information about each other's sexual abuse policies and protocols that are shared as well, and learn what happens when an actual report, you know, an allegation of sexual abuse occurs and what that happens with the facility. Where do they take the victim and the abuser? You know, what services do they already provide, whether it's mental health or other services, medical. Learn what hospital those individuals are transported to and who serves as the external reporting option. It's also helpful to learn what challenges the facility may have to help, that would be helpful, like to improve individual services, and whether or not if an advocate program of beyond individual services via phone and mail are available. Make sure that the Rape Crisis Center may not have, you know, make sure that they have the capacity to do what they can at that point, and then things can expand and evolve as time goes on. Again, Corey stated how early on that was something that they had trouble with, and you know, they had to know where they could be. But discuss your shared goal of eliminating sexual abuse. So think for a minute about meeting someone for the very first time. Think of how it can feel when you know, met that person and them asking to borrow your car, or having them ask you to take care of their children, you know, someone you don't even know. Sure, once you know someone, give and take is a normal part of the relationship, but you know, you have to think about this as that relationship, as developing a partnership, and creating this MOU and providing services to incarcerated survivors is a process. You know, it can be abrupt and off-putting for either partner to just jump in and start developing the MOU. And, you know, in fact, discussing the scope of services before you even develop the MOU is going to be best. It's not to say that at the end, the goal of developing an MOU and providing service shouldn't be known, but it will serve the relationship well to not only get to know one another better, but also discuss, you know, the scope of services, any limitations, and opportunities for growth you have, and potential challenges. So, for example, some things you might want to bring up. What services can the Rape Crisis Center provide or are already providing to individuals? And what will the corrections agency do to facilitate these services? And something that Rape Crisis Centers really should keep in mind as time goes on is what support the Sexual Assault Coalition can also provide. So before leaving a meeting, just make sure you establish next steps, including where you might meet next or how you'll communicate later on. You don't want to leave it open-ended. We've said in other webinars that touring the facility is critical, no matter how services will be provided, whether it's phone, mail, in person. But understanding the living situation of the facility will really help those advocates to give them what they need and tailor coping mechanisms to meet those survivors. Next steps might include developing a timeline for drafting that MOU. Find out who needs to review and approve that draft and how long it'll take. So don't forget about cross-training. You really need to emphasize that. And make sure you talk about bringing hospitals into the discussion. Remember, they are part of this process. Go tour the hospital together. You may have individuals with the jail that have never even been there, don't even know who the SANE or ER staff might be on there. So make sure it can be a process that you really get a chance to bond and grow that partnership.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Okay, so now that we've talked, again, re-emphasize things we've mentioned in other webinars about building a relationship, it's now time to focus on developing the actual MOU. And to help us think about developing the MOU, I'm pleased to introduce you to my colleague, Chris Mady, they, them, theirs, who's a senior program officer for JDI. Chris comes to JDI from Charleston, South Carolina, where they worked at People Against Rape, or PAR. While at PAR, Chris worked with jails and prisons to provide services to incarcerated sexual abuse survivors. At JDI, they help implement JDI's wellness programs inside prisons and jails, answer survivor letters, is part of the Inside Line Hotline project with Michigan and Vermont DOCs that we heard about in an earlier webinar. And they also provide coaching support to 2 grantees who were awarded PREA demonstration grants. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here to share your experiences.
Thank you for having me.
You know, we met originally when you were working at PAR in Charleston, so before we were colleagues at JDI. And I know that the South Carolina DOC has agreements with rape crisis centers throughout the state to provide services to the state's prisons, but PAR was ahead of this curve. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work at PAR, specifically about how the decision was made to provide services to incarcerated survivors in the Charleston area?
For sure. So when I was at PAR, we actually had a lot of different facilities in our service area. So we had 3 county jails, 2 state prisons, 1 pre-release center, a military lockup facility, and a federal facility. So we had a lot of different facilities that we were trying to work with. And before I had started working there, there had been some talk about starting up services, but they hadn't really gotten a lot of traction there. So once I started, I kind of decided that that would be a project that I wanted to work on. And we were really able to start building relationships with the facilities and actually began a full spectrum of services, including hotline, letter writing, in-person services, forensic exam and accompaniment. So kind of full spectrum after those relationships were built.
Wow, I mean, I recalled that it was several facilities, but when you listed off that long list, it's quite a lot that, you know, one rape crisis center was, you know, going to be working with. Can you say a little bit more about how you got started building these relationships and providing services? And, did you have a goal to get an MOU in place? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, so I think it always comes back to building relationships. I know Corey talked a lot about it, and I'm sure on the rest of the series, you've talked a lot about building relationships and the importance there. And I think that's what comes first before the MOU. So I will admit, when I first started working at PAR, I didn't even know what an MOU was. So it was definitely a learning process to really understand, like, okay, this is a facility that's going to need a more official agreement than like just saying, oh yeah, we'll work with each other. Let's do services. Of course, these people are part of our community. Let's provide services. It needed to be more than that. It needed to be a little bit more official. So I did some internal learning and found out what an MOU was, and talked to the facilities about what they were looking for and about what we could do, and tried to be realistic about that. I think something that, like I said, is we had so many facilities in our service area, 8 facilities. And that was really hard to figure out, okay, what do we actually have the capacity to do? That's a lot of facilities. And even just deciding, like, what facility do we start with? That sort of thing. Those were sort of hard discussions to have. And we only had I was one of 4 staff members. So we're talking a pretty small agency with a lot of different facilities. So all of that kind of came into play when thinking about how do we really want to get started. But it did start with the relationships, not with the MOUs. I will say some facilities were some of the facilities we were working with were very like, I want to get this MOU signed now. They didn't want to have that whole back and forth, building a relationship, figuring out what the services could really look like. And I would caution you, to the folks listening on the call now, to not jump into doing that. I think that's where things can get into someone just signing a piece of paper and that paper not really meaning anything. The whole point of an MOU is for it to really mean something and for you to have really comprehensive services and to have an agreement between both of you about what's actually going to take place, not for them to use that in an audit.
Chris, you've alluded to this a little bit in your remarks, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about things that that were easier than expected in this process, and maybe things that were bigger challenges.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was easier was some of the facilities were very receptive to having advocates there. They wanted to get involved. They wanted to figure out what they could do. And we were really able to offer kind of an easy solution for them. I think especially figuring out hotline services. And once they were set in one facility, even though it was a different type of facility, so we were able to get hotline services pretty easily set up with the prisons in our service area. And then the jails were saying, oh, well, we don't know how to do that. And I was able to connect the jails with the prisons so they could talk through, like, okay, this is how you can do it on that phone line. This is how GTL can go around recording the calls, things like that I don't necessarily know, but the facilities were able to talk to each other a little bit more about that. And that was very, very helpful. So that was one of the
that's interesting.
That was nice. Yeah. So if you're able to do that, to have different PREA coordinators talk to each other, to create conversations like that, that can be really, really helpful.
Great. And now, Chris, in your role, you work with a lot of different jurisdictions all over the nation to provide a wide range of support and assistance, not just as a victim advocate, but I wonder if you could, offer, if there's any other advice that you have for our corrections partners that are with us or the advocates that are with us today about working together.
For sure. So again, I think the number one thing about MOUs in specific is to make sure it's not just a piece of paper. It's really up to you as the advocate and you as in the facility to really make sure that there's a relationship there and that you can really offer the services that are in that piece of paper, so it's meaningful. The other thing that can be really helpful is just thinking about what amount of term you want to have on your MOU. So do you want it to expire every year so you have to revisit it? That could be helpful with maybe a smaller jail that's struggling to stay in contact with you. Or do you want it to be every 3 years because it's a huge process to get it signed by the people that need to sign it? So there's kind of different things that you can play around with depending on the facilities you're working with. But again, the main thing is just having constant contact with the facilities. That's really where I think that's the biggest piece of advice I can give you. Constant contact with different contacts at the facility. So not just the PREA coordinator, but also people in medical, people in mental health, and also the incarcerated population as well. So figure out who the leaders are at the facilities, who in the incarcerated population, and talk with them about what they want. That can be very, very helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for the advice, for your perspective and explanation of the work that you did at PAR and around the nation. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're willing to hang on, we've got some challenges that we're going to address in a few slides that I'd love to get your perspective on as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so like we mentioned in the last webinar, there's a supplementary questionnaire for auditors to use in their interactions with those of you that are victim service providers. So we do have that link at the end of this webinar as well, in case you didn't get it last time. And I just want to reemphasize, like we said in the last webinar, that the tool is not just for auditors. I actually think it's a great tool to be used in the development of or in the revising of an MOU. And the reason being is it really digs deep into the details, like Chris mentioned, of service provision. So it will help you to make sure that your MOUs are not just a piece of paper, but are also very descriptive about the services that are going to be provided. And you know, to reemphasize again, more detail is better than less. You know, make sure that there are clear roles, responsibilities, and processes, and these will help you really mitigate challenges and obstacles during the implementation phase. The tool is also a useful guide for the kinds of things to discuss when determining the services that will be provided. Later in the webinar, we will provide some sample MOU language, but also just a reminder that NC CASA's the North Carolina approach. Again, you can get on NC CASA's website, and we have a link at the end of the webinar, includes sample MOU languages. So you can take those, again, don't just take them as they are, take them and really think about them and work with your partners and revise them as needed. But those are useful tools, so you don't have to start from scratch. And keep in mind a quote from the North Carolina approach that I read. It said, revisit, revise, and review. So you never want to let your MOU become stagnant. And like Corey mentioned, you know, things change over time, and it's good to have written into the agreement a set time for reevaluation. And then like Corey mentioned, the ability to make revisions as time goes on as needed. So let's talk some specifics about the MOU. So generally, it should describe the commitments of each party. So it shouldn't just be about what the jail will do. It shouldn't just be about what the advocacy organization will do. It should be about both. And we'll review some of that language in a moment. So again, make sure that you're clear and specific. So for example, if the Rape Crisis Center is only able to provide services during certain hours, put those hours in the MOU. But also like allow, you know, again, allow for changes and review the PREA standards to make sure that your MOU includes what's necessary to be in compliance. So some details could be about how advocates will handle requests outside the scope of services. For example, like if there's an off-topic caller who may be asking about legal assistance, financial assistance, pen pals, or other things that are totally unrelated to sexual abuse or trauma. And just a quick note on the side is that in JDI's experience, those kind of calls come in because either A, people have very limited resources and they see that the advocate is a way that they might be able to get some response, or because they just didn't understand the purpose of that hotline. And in fact, in the hotline that JDI runs, we don't get crank calls like that. So or prank calls, but it's important to know what you would do in those situations, similar to those of you that are advocates, how you would respond if you got those kinds of off-topic calls from people in the community. Like we've talked about multiple times, it should also address confidentiality. You know, we also mentioned in an earlier webinar that the PREA standards require that prisoners have reasonable access to outside support services in as confidential a manner as possible. They must be free of charge, and they must be provided free of charge. So many facilities will allow prisoners to communicate with advocates via phone in a manner that is confidential, unmonitored, and unrecorded. And if for some reason the facility finds it necessary to monitor or record the communications, They must discuss this with the victim service providers and inform prisoners of those limitations. Just know that it is possible for the phone vendors to program the phones to make sure they're not recorded, and even assign like a universal PIN for people to use. And while the facility may not know this, as was mentioned before, but they can, but together you can approach the phone vendor and discuss modifications to existing contracts. The facility must also be aware of the Rape Crisis Center's ethical and legal obligations to maintain confidentiality and the limited circumstances under which they may break confidentiality. And also don't forget to include things about security procedures. For example, if the advocates need a security clearance, or what kind of security they will have at the facility or the hospital. So let's look at some sample language. As I just mentioned, there should be a section that goes through what the jail agrees to. So examples of this can be about the involvement of the rape crisis advocates. I'll just read these out loud so folks can see them on the screen. Make involvement of the rape crisis advocates a component of the standard response to a report of sexual violence that occurred during incarceration. Any time that an incident or allegation of sexual abuse is discovered or reported within hours of the incident. Notice here that I put the XX because the time frames under which a forensic exam will be conducted across the state does vary. So you want to be specific about those time frames. The local rape crisis center will be notified. And be sure to check with your jurisdiction about the time frames. And again, you can also refer back to the PREA 101 webinar. And then the last bullet here is about making sure that when there is access to a hotline, that if there's one way to provide, that is one way to provide services. So in this example, the jail agreed to provide prisoners with confidential access to the rape crisis hotline through the telephone system between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. And just a quick acknowledgement, I recognize a couple of questions have come in, and so we'll address those probably later in the Q&A or during the challenges section. So thank you for submitting those. Here's a few more things about examples of language for what the jail may agree to. One is about respecting the confidential nature of communication between the advocates and clients. Another is to facilitate the placement of informational placards with instructions on how to access the relevant rape crisis hotline areas and make sure that they're visible to prisoners. And also to communicate any questions or concerns with the Rape Crisis Center staff. So now let's take a look at what some sample language might be for what the Rape Crisis Center agrees to. First, to accept the hotline calls during that agreed upon time frame. Again, this is just sample timeframes. You may want to adjust those as needed. Also, to respond to requests when advocates are available to provide accompaniment for the forensic exam at the local hospital, and to provide follow-up services to individuals who are survivors of sexual assault via telephone and when available in-person services as resources allow. Keep in mind that the PREA standards say that there need to be phone and mail options. If you do something like in person, that's certainly going, that's fantastic and is going above and beyond what the standards are requiring. And so just a few more things, sample language, that maintaining confidentiality of communications with clients detained at the jail. That you will inform the PREA coordinator of any instances when there's mandated reporting. Remember that there is specific language in North Carolina law about when advocates are mandatory reporters. So an example might be if someone says that they're going to hurt themselves or someone else. That you would secure consent and release of information. If a client in custody requests that the advocate share the information with the jail or another party. And remember, per North Carolina statute, it has to be written consent. And also to communicate any questions or concerns about the MOU or relationship between the jail and the Rape Crisis Center to the PREA coordinator or whoever your point of contact is. And again, don't forget, NC CASA is here to help you with this, because again, this is not, we don't want you just to take this language and use it as is. We want it to make it very specific to your relationships. Okay, so the hope is that the development of the MOU, while it may take time, will be a fairly smooth process. But I think as we heard today, that along the way, there may be some difficult conversations But hopefully you can reach an understanding or compromise to continue to move things forward. But maybe it's just my luck, or call it Murphy's Law, or something else. But no matter how careful you have been to include details on roles and responsibilities and how those services will be provided, inevitably something's going to crop up that will require you to come back together to work out the two kinks. So the next few slides, again, I'm going to welcome back Corey and Chris to talk through their experiences about different challenges and solutions that they've experienced as we review these slides. But before we do that, I want to read some words of inspiration about why it's worth the work to overcome the challenges that might be standing in the way of you doing this work at the level that you would like to. So this is from Jessie, a crisis intervention peer counselor. And they said, I would tell other advocates who are new to this kind of work, the struggle is worth it. Everyone deserves an advocate, deserves someone there if they have survived a rape, no matter what their past is. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at a few challenges. So we're going to start first with capacity. And I know we've mentioned this many times throughout the webinar series. Excuse me. So a common concern amongst rape crisis centers is whether or not they have the staff time and ability to handle the call volume from incarcerated survivors. And just knowing that many rape crisis centers across North Carolina are in rural locations, some of you might be thinking about that same concern. So here are a few solutions that have been used elsewhere. So that you should use the existing hotline that your organization already has, don't have a separate line. And just limit your hours to business hours only, which is likely when you're going to have more people available to answer calls. Or if you know that a facility, that the prisoners only have access to the phone during nights and weekends, maybe you make those the hours of service. Keep in mind, in our hotline with Vermont and Michigan, we have specific hours. I think it's from like 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. or something like that. So it's not a 24 hours a day. And a totally different concern that JDI has heard from advocates is their capacity to work with incarcerated survivors. So often this is not so much about working with a population of people who've committed crimes, but more a concern about not knowing enough about how jails operate, their policies, and how they might conflict with providing services in a trauma-informed way. So a couple of solutions, and then I'll ask Chris and Corey for their advice. So first of all, training for advocates is really critical to address apprehensions that people might have about working with incarcerated survivors. So again, we've mentioned this several times, it's even been mentioned today, that it can also be about, just the basic logistics of the facility, or going for a tour of the facility, that can be really, really helpful. An additional solution can be about providing advocates with ongoing training and simply, and again, exposure and practice working with survivors. I was talking with some advocates yesterday, and they in Pennsylvania, and they were saying that this is a concern of their colleagues. And so one of the takeaways was that they were going to start working on a shadowing program. So those that were already comfortable working with incarcerated survivors, they were going to have other advocates join them as a shadow program. Corey or Chris, any other thoughts that you have about capacity concerns, whether it be about the volume of clients or just working with incarcerated survivors?
The only thing I'd love to add, this is Chris, is that the reality is you're not going to get that many calls from a facility. I mean, you're going to get some, it's definitely going to add to your numbers, but it's not going to be so overwhelming. And I think the important thing for me is always to remember that these are folks that are part of our community too. So just like we wouldn't say like, oh, people on this street can't call us. We didn't want that to be like, oh, people at this facility can't call us. So just remembering the importance of having that access.
Great, thanks, Chris. Corey, any thoughts from you?
So I would echo that sentiment is that I think everyone has this anxiety that calls will just come flooding in, and we haven't seen that either. We are using our existing hotline, so that's where the calls go into, and I think that we did have a lot of staff that had that concern around not understanding the dynamics and having that lack of kind of knowledge and that anxiety. But honestly, a lot of the calls, they might not have even realized it, that they were talking to someone that was incarcerated at the time. And so we really wanted staff, we wanted to acknowledge that, and that's where having that strong partnership and looking to the experts, we were able to develop a PowerPoint that was very specific to our jail, as well as Just Detention International has some amazing trainings, and that's pretty much all staff that come in when they're in that beginning phase of learning, and then like just ongoing, we have them watch a lot of the webinars that are recorded just to get that knowledge base and have a greater understanding.
Great, thank you both so much for that. So another concern, and I know we've talked a lot about confidentiality over the webinars, but this is really where a sticking point in terms of relationships. So just keep in mind, again, that for corrections, safety is a top priority. And when it comes to sexual abuse, all staff are mandated to report any suspicion or knowledge of abuse. On the other hand, advocates have an ethical and legal obligation to keep clients' information private. And it's one of your core principles is around empowering survivors by giving them choices, the choice to report or not to report. So when jails and victim advocates start working together on you know, going through these various discussions we've mentioned about, especially around confidentiality and privacy, and even including like what that looks like for phone calls, that can often be a sticking point. So some additional solutions to other things that we've already talked about include, again, looking to technology to help you out with this. This can include setting up a number and universal PIN for prisoners to use to access an unmonitored and unrecorded line. And again, we've worked in another jurisdiction, JDI that is, worked in another jurisdiction where the PIN, when the PIN was dialed, it signaled that the phone line not to record the call and block staff from listening in on the call. And it also allowed the caller to make the call without identifying themselves, which is really critical. And it connected directly to the local rape crisis center. And another option is for individuals who want to maybe talk with their counselors about scheduling a call with an advocate in private. So of course, this means they wouldn't have anonymity because they'd be asking a staff person to arrange the call. But if they felt safe doing so, it's a great option because the survivor can also feel at ease knowing that no one is nearby listening or rushing them to hang out or to hang up. And it's also important for advocates to review the limits to confidentiality with each client and not just assume that they know and understand what those limits might be. And so just keep in mind too that North Carolina's statute, state statute states that the communication between an advocate and a client is privileged, which hopefully will assist in the discussions around confidentiality with your corrections partners. And at JDI, what we have noticed is that when we meet with staff at facilities that may be less familiar with PREA and the inmates' rights to this type of confidentiality at their facilities. So it sometimes takes work to educate staff on just the importance of confidentiality in the healing process. So on your screen, you can see an image, it's got lots of highlights on it. These are tools that we developed in collaboration with the National PREA Resource Center. These are called PREA refreshers, and we've got a link to these at the end for you. But the intent of the refreshers is to focus on specific PREA topics. So this one, the reason I included it is because it's about inmate support services. And the idea is to take what is required by the PREA standards and make them user-friendly for corrections staff in their day-to-day jobs. And so again, the hope is that these can be useful to line staff and can help to further their knowledge in addition to what they receive maybe in annual training. So again, this is one that's specific about support services. I encourage you to take a look at it, but this might be an approach to education that you can use with corrections staff to help them to understand the role of advocates. Another issue that's emerged elsewhere in our work is that some of the hospitals were not calling the advocates when prisoners were brought to the forensic exam. And that often was happening when a victim came in from the forensic exam from the community or the facility. So it wasn't specifically about the incarcerated survivor, even though they were supposed to be calling the local advocate before the beginning the exam so the victim could have the advocate present for support. And in one location, because the hospitals were inconsistent about doing this, the jails agreed that they would call the advocate before transporting them to the hospital. And this was language that was actually added to the MOU and the jail's PREA protocols, and it really helped things. This approach can be especially beneficial for programs in rural locations. And getting the call from the jail allows the advocates time to plan for an advocate to meet them at the hospital. This is not only important because survivors deserve someone to be with them if they choose that for the exam, but also because it can help to build rapport with them so that when the advocates are providing follow-up services, they already have a relationship. And another possibility is not having a hospital in the same county as the jail. And Corey, I seem to recall there's something that maybe this was a situation that you've encountered in your work. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So for us specifically, that wasn't the case. Safe Alliance used to be in multiple counties, our services. And so we did have something prior to my starting to where we did respond to a call that was in another county from Mecklenburg County, but we also were providing services in Mecklenburg County, sexual assaults. No, in Union County at the time that were sexual assault.
Got it.
So sorry.
Okay, thank you for that.
And
no,
Tara,
it's okay, thank you. Yeah,
Tara,
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak to that because when I was at PAR, we had a facility, the only sane site was in the county that I was working in. And so one of the facilities was outside of our service area, but they would bring their survivors to our sane. So we would serve them. So I think that adds an added piece for MOUs too. So if you're just doing forensic exam accompaniment, making sure you have a relationship with the Rape Crisis Center that the facility is actually at, but also that you have an MOU with the facility just about that forensic exam can be helpful. So
yeah, that's really great advice.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. That was actually what I was going to mention, that there may be some things to work around depending on the availability of a SANE in the jurisdiction where you're serving or where the jail is located. So thank you for that. And then just quickly, around the nation, corrections facilities are chronically short of staff. And many also face a high turnover rate. And so rape crisis centers, often you all face a similar challenge. So one jurisdiction that JDI worked with within the first 2 years of the project, about half of the PREA compliance officers, and this was in a state jurisdiction, turned over at least once. And then also there were several rape crisis centers that got new executive directors. And because these centers were really small, those were typically the main contacts for the relationship. And so that's why, and it's been mentioned before as well, about really strongly recommending that there's a team at both the facility, the detention facility and the rape crisis center. And so, just because there is turnover, and so you don't want to lose traction just because you have to get someone else up to speed. And the last thing, we have a couple more slides before we are going to answer your questions, is about communication. And again, it's one of those issues that you constantly have to work on in a partnership, and that staff at both the jails and the rape crisis centers are incredibly busy. And so many of you are all wearing multiple hats with competing responsibilities. And so we hear from both prisons from jails and advocates that sometimes they have trouble reaching one another. So as there's been advice given already today about that. And so I just want to stress that it's important to have an understanding of each other's daily operations and limitations. I know there have been some corrections officials that the best thing for me to do was to call first thing in the morning before they had sat down and opened their email or started working with things at the facility. And so just kind of figuring out those rhythms is really important. Find out how busy those people are that you're working with, and respect each other's time, and just acknowledge the fact that, your call, your email may not be acknowledged right away. And it's not because it wasn't important, it just wasn't the priority that they were able to focus on. And that what needed their immediate attention. So again, thinking about those early meetings, this can be a helpful way to set the tone for your communication and talk about it openly and decide what's the best way to communicate. And so I'm going to actually skip forward to the questions because I want to make sure that we get to those. So before we do the questions, then we're going to go back to a quick exercise. So if I had an advocate, this is just a quote from Frank Mendoza, who is a survivor and member of JDI's Survivor Council. And he said, "If I had had an advocate, it would have saved me so much grief. It would have helped me through that traumatic event immensely. And going through it alone, I didn't know who I could trust and who I could talk to about it, which appeared to be nobody. So what I want to do is I'm going to leave it on this slide. It's not our question slide, but I know that there were 2 questions that have been submitted. So I want to address those before we go any further. So the first one is for Corey, actually, is if you could say a little bit more, Corey, and even for you know, other presenters as well, how do you navigate around collect calls?
So yes, actually that was, I highlighted or I commented on that early because that was when we were super excited to figure out how to make it work. And so what we were able to do is, and it's really is a workaround, but it works because we've tried it and we have received calls. But when someone calls the national hotline for sexual assault, they are funneled back to their local rape crisis center. And so what the residents at the facility will do when they call that number, it funnels them back to us. So it's not always clear 100% on our caller ID where that person's calling from, but it does allow us, it allowed us to move forward in our process with the MOU and begin to start taking calls. Again, I think there's always a work in progress, and we know there's others that may not fall within this, but that was what we were able to do to kind of get this process started and moving.
Great, thank you, Corey. I know I was talking with, like, again, some advocates, and as I mentioned, in Pennsylvania, and some of them, it's just part of their processes to accept collect calls from the jail. They don't actually have a hotline set up, and so that's just the process that they've established. Chris, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, great.
Tara, this is Lisa. I would like to add that there definitely are different counties that are already doing this, and even prisons that have this level of involvement, and NC CASA most certainly can support you and connect your local facility with someone who maybe has the same service provider, like GTL or some of the others. I mean, there's really only a handful that we use in North Carolina anyway. So we can connect you with a resource that can really help you so that you're not having to try to do that workaround, because it really is something that most of all the providers that we've spoken with have a way to do this. It just might mean that, you know, some contract changes or things of that nature might have to come up. But NC CASA is definitely there to help support and connect both corrections and rape crisis centers with resources.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And the other question that came in is about what do you all, and I take that as for advocates, do to avoid secondhand trauma. And I think I'll turn to Chris and Corey, if you wouldn't mind giving your thoughts about that.
I can start. This is Corey. I think that this is something just across the board that we recognize as an agency is out there. And so we really have tried to embed that concept of what vicarious trauma, secondhand trauma, all of those aspects can look like. And so it's a part of just the education to make sure staff in onboarding understand the importance of having really solid coping skills, understanding those pieces around that work that they can personally do. It comes up in regular supervisions, and then we're actually starting a new initiative of bringing in what is a trauma-informed kind of community process that looks at staff and the clients we're working with. So we're in the process of really developing some embedded within our organization processes we can do.
Great, thank you, Corey. Chris, any thoughts from you?
And I do want to just echo what Corey was saying. I think paying attention to what your own needs are is so important. And then also when you're working with incarcerated survivors, for me, what I found most difficult is that sometimes it can feel like a hopeless situation. Like you're not able to provide the full amount of help that you want or that you could for someone in the community. And that can be really frustrating. So for me, it's always just to remember, like, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And that you really are helping. So just always remembering that.
Great, thank you both for that. But I know we're tight on time. This is an exercise that had we been in person, we would have had enough time to do, and I apologize we ran out of time today. But it's about what is your WHOOP? And this idea comes from, I was reading an article recently about healthy habits that people have developed in this time of being at their homes more and in quarantine. So for example, maybe starting a running regimen. And as people transition back to working, say in an office or, back at their jobs and not at home, how do you sustain those habits going forward? And so the idea was that if you, set out your wish for what you want to do, that you want to maintain this running habit, the outcome of doing that, say it makes you feel good. But there are some obstacles, like really naming what those obstacles are and then setting out a plan for yourself about how you're going to still come over those, overcome those obstacles and still work towards your wish. But there's actually been evidence to show that people were more successful in doing this. So this wasn't just like something that was made up recently. Anyways, so my challenge to you as we close out today's webinar is to think about what is your WHOOP for developing an MOU or building a partnership, whether it be with your local jail or with your local rape crisis center. And, oftentimes when I do these kinds of exercises, I'm asked to develop SMART goals, that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. But I want to put a twist on it. And instead of developing SMART goals, I want you to name your WHOOP. So take a few minutes at the end of this webinar and write down for yourself, what is your wish? What is it that you're wanting to do? What is the outcome of that? What are some obstacles that you already know or that you could perceive coming up as a result? And then what is your plan for overcoming those obstacles and working towards making that wish come true? And I'd encourage you to think about it like, what are you going to do in the next week? For those of you that mentioned you don't know if you have an MOU, maybe that's your wish, is to find out if you have an MOU. So then you could find out whether or not, you're providing services to individuals. Go back and make that happen. Maybe in the next month, you want to pick up the phone for the first time and reach out to your partner and try to set up a call to start, getting these relationships going. I would encourage you to share your WHOOPs back with NC CASA. That will help them to kind of know what's on your mind and how they can support you. So again, Courtney has provided the link to whoopmylife.org. And it's really interesting. I think I hope that you enjoy it as an exercise to thinking about how you want to take what you've learned in this webinar series and put it into practice in developing your relationships in the community. And so with that, I'll just quickly go over some resources. Our Hope Behind Bars, which is a resource from JDI that we've talked about in several of these webinars. Also a link to the North Carolina approach, which you can find on the NC CASA website, and additional sample MOUs and templates on JDI's website. We've also included the link to the supplementary questionnaire that we mentioned that's for advocates, or excuse me, for auditors, but I think is really helpful for developing an MOU. And then also the link to the PREA refreshers. And again, you can get these will all be posted, these links on the NC CASA website. So I know it's a lot to write down now, but I encourage you to go there. And again, if there's any way that JDI can be of assistance, I know NC CASA and JDI, we're here for you in any way that we can. You can certainly reach out to us on the email address that you see on your screen. We do have the ability to provide technical assistance through some of our grants, so definitely reach out if you have questions or if there's a way that we can be of assistance. And with that, I'll hand things over to Gabriella to close us out.
Hey everyone, so if you have any questions about PREA or the webinar series, please feel free to contact Robin or Courtney Dunkerton, and their emails will show up in a second.
Sorry about that. Whoops.
Oh, it's all good. Just a reminder, NC CASA will be transitioning PREA technical assistance to our member services team. Before this happens, we will be surveying centers on their PREA needs and providing addendums to the PREA status report. That will be an update on the webinar participation and the survey results. So please be on the lookout for that. If you have attended any of these webinars in the past or any of our NC CASA webinars, you know that during this time you will receive a certificate for attending the webinar. So please be on the lookout for our email from training@NC CASA on how to receive a certificate for attending this webinar. This webinar will be posted on our website and on our NC CASA YouTube channel. So if you ever need to look at the resources or any of this information, you can go there to find this information. I hope you all have a great day. And once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to our presenters or to Robin Colbert or Courtney Dunkerton. Thank you. Have a great day, and thank you to our presenters as well and our guest speakers.